Let's talk about Victoria. I'm not going to sing for you today, but you know what we are going to do? Is we're going to talk about the pro, or more the downside actually. So the cons, or the things to be weary of and just know about Victoria as being a landlord in there, so that you can forecast and mitigate and get around it. Now, for a bit of context before I go into this, I am somebody, if you didn't know, who started off buying my properties in Victoria because that's where I was born and raised, and I have held on to more properties in Victoria than any other state at one given time. So at one given time, I've had 4 properties inside Victoria, and I've held on to Victorian properties from day one since being an investor. So what that means is I have a very good understanding of what the current rules are and the limitations. Now, for caveat, today, what I'm going through is not all of the downsides. I'm just going through the ones that are the most pain compared to other states. That's all I'm walking you through today. Now, next thing to be mindful of. When it comes to building a property portfolio, as an investor and as a coach, the thing that everyone needs to focus on when they're first beginning to build their portfolio is the number one thing that is the most important when starting to build out your wealth is building your net wealth, so your capital. That's the number one thing. So even though I'm giving you these downsides today, does not mean that you shouldn't not buy in Victoria at all. If Victoria at that given moment and that particular suburb that you're buying inside of Victoria is about to boom, and the capital growth is going to make you hundreds of thousands of dollars, then it is worthwhile learning how to get around and put up with the bit of a pains that I'm about to walk you through. So I'm going to give you a bit of context. I myself am an active investor in Victoria, all across Australia, wherever the data says to buy in. That will always trump the downsides for me. With these downsides are so small into comparison to the upsides of the capital growth. So I just want to let you know that. So let's go through some of the things just to be mindful of so that you can steer around them and get around them. And let's just call it the devil you're about to get into bed with, right? All right, so here comes a good old PowerPoint slide again from Olivia. So number one, the biggest downside that is a bit of a pain in the bum to me is there are only 3 ways that you can kick a tenant out. This is if a tenant who is paying their bills on time, and so they're paying their rent on time, they're not damaging the property, and their lease has actually ended. Number 1, you either have to prove that you are about to move back into the property yourself. Number 2, you have to prove that you are actually going to sell the property and it's on the market. Number 3, you either have to prove that you're going to renovate the property so much that it's unsafe and unhumane for them to continue to live in there. So I'll give you, and you might be thinking, well, why do you want to kick a tenant out who's paying the rent on time and not damaging the property? It's a really good question. So sometimes, very rarely, sometimes you can have tenants who are so annoying to the point where one tiny ass little thing can go wrong that is such a small problem, but they can play on it and can be such nasty tenants by saying, this small thing's broken, and if you don't fix this within 24 hours, I'm taking you to VCAT, right? Where they just want to throw the bloody law book at you. Obviously, that is the property manager's job to mitigate that and put up with that. But sometimes you can have a real pain in the ass of tenants. Now, it's extremely rare. I've only ever had one tenant who's done it to me. It sometimes can feel like that you're feeling a little bit suffocated and you might want to get rid of them. And now in most other states, as soon as their lease has ended, without any of these 3 things, without needing to do any of these three things, you can just literally say, we're ending the lease. We don't want to extend you. You got to move out once their lease ends. And now to me, as a landlord, that sounds reasonable to me. These 3 things have now become a little bit unreasonable from my personal perspective. What this means is if you're taking or buying a property, for example, that already has a tenant in, this is something that I talk about and I coach with my private one-on-one coaches about, on how to make sure that you're identifying the type of tenant you're taking on if there's an existing tenant in there. And there's a whole bunch of things that I do. That's something separate I work with my clients on as well. So that's just something, if I was taking on an existing tenant, I would want to run through all of these things to make sure I understand the devil that I'm getting into bed with. Also, when it comes to selling a property in Victoria, which is a pain in the bum, is if you plan on selling, which again, for most of my clients, as I always work with my clients on how to make sure that selling should be the worst case scenario Again, I have a separate video on selling real estate, but sometimes it does make sense to sell a property, and whether or not you're stuck in, you need it to free up your borrowing capacity, whether it's a shit area, or it could be a number of different things. But again, I have a separate video on that. If you want that video, comment the word sale and we'll send that to you. So the other big downside in Victoria is I did sell a property in Victoria. And if you have one of those nasty tenants that just really push shit uphill a lot, that can be extremely painful. And so, for example, some of those rules are you need to give tenants 7 days notice for every time you want to have an open inspection. Then on top of that, the tenant can just decline. So it's very, very hard to sell a property in Victoria. I was considering selling a property, one of my properties in Victoria, which I'm now not because it's about to boom. And luckily for my clients, we have all the data to forecast if a suburb's about to boom or not. And this particular property is about to boom. So it's worthwhile for me. I've decided to keep this particular property, even though it's got a lot of maintenance problems, and I've got one of those annoying tenants that I'm referring to as well. So it's worth for me putting up all of this painful stuff for the next 18 to 24 months sort of period. Next thing is, you can't jump the rent up massively. Now, talking about rents and ethical investing, that's a separate discussion that I'm not going to talk about here, which I have created in other videos. It is worthwhile understanding, and again, this is something that I teach my clients, is on understanding when inflation is going to hit. Because when you can understand when they're going to print money, which leads to I should not use the word hyperinflation, but when it leads to extreme inflation booms, which is what we would have experienced during 2021 to 2023 sort of window, because Australia printed $1.1 trillion in 2020. So that then has a flow-on effect of massive rents increasing. Now, in most other states in Australia, you can literally just say, well, the average in this area has boomed, and let's just say it's gone up $100 a week. That is huge. Now, in other states, you can literally say, well, the average has gone up this much, so I'm entitled to increase it that much. But in Victoria, you can't do that. So in Victoria, there's like this reasonable amount, which is absolutely ridiculous. And now there's a lot of gray areas to this. So I'm not going to go into this, and it's critical for you to understand everything that I'm telling you here today in this video. All of these things could change. And so this is also really important as to why, as an investor, you need to triple check with your property managers and always ask your property managers, where do I legally stand here? What do I legally have to do? What do I legally have to prove here to either fix an item or get around this particular thing? So for example, I had a property where the rent had jumped during that inflationary period $100 a week, literally $100 a week. Now, I think it's reasonable for me to just charge what it's worth. And because everywhere else had gone up $100 a week, I should be able to increase my rent by $100 a week. But in Victoria, they say, unless you've added some sort of reasonable extra added features inside the house, then you shouldn't be able to jump it up by that much. Even though the average, and that's what it's worth, even though if they were to move out of this property, that's what they would end up paying. So can you see it's a bit of like this fucking catch-22, a bit of a loophole that you could be stuck in. Then we talk about, well, then how much could you jump the rent up by? So what ended up being reasonable for me at that time was I could only jump it up by about, I think it was like $30 or $40 a week. So, but it still was behind $60 a week to compare to everywhere else. If you are on the front foot already, and this is why it's important to always make sure you're always charging the top dollar that you can when we're not going through those big inflationary periods. But again, if you're somebody who's working with me, you would be able to forecast this into the future and understand when those cycles are about to come. So that's why it's critical to always be charging the top end of the average in the area. And it's also very, very important to understand what the actual average is in your area and not take the answer from your property managers. Again, I have another training on that, on how to identify what is your property actually worth from a rent, and don't trust your property managers, because 100% of the time, 100% of every single time any of my properties, doesn't matter what state it is, any of my properties needed renewing, every single one of my property managers had down quoted me, so quoted me less than what it was actually worth. So it's important to always stay on the top dollar. And it's always important to understand when that new inflation boom is about to happen again. So that by the time the inflationary boom occurs, well, you were already at the front foot and trying to charge as much as you possibly could. And don't forget, this also impacts your borrowing capacity a lot to understand this sort of stuff. So you might be then thinking, well, if you're, say, for example, you're at the front foot, everyone else is charging, let's just say this left hand here is you. So you're charging this amount and everyone else is just charging under, and then inflation hits, and then all of a sudden, everyone else is charging more and the average is more in that area. Don't worry, because then what will happen is, again, if you understand what the rent could be in that area, eventually you will catch up and get in front of the front foot when that inflationary period starts to calm down. So that has happened exactly for me right now, right? So in 2021, 2022, I was like this. I was like this to begin with, right? Then inflation hit. My average, all of my the tenants in Victoria were paying under the average, but over the last couple of years, we've now been able to catch up. Okay, so it's just a cycle that happens. You just have to prepare for those cycles. Now, a caveat to all of this, again, I'm not saying that these are the rules. What I'm saying is now be wary of them, of these things, and now go and triple check these with your property managers. The property managers are the people who are staying on top of the rules that are consistently changing. So again, just a reminder, this does not mean that you shouldn't buy in Victoria. If Victoria was the only place that had all of the top 1% suburbs, then fuck, I would be buying in it. Or if it was the one that had the most amount of suburbs, the best suburbs. So let's just say there was, the top 1% that me and my team buy in, right? So let's just say there was suburbs scattered in Queensland and WA and South Australia. There were some top 1% suburbs, but let's just say the best of that 1% was only in Victoria. I would still be buying in that area though as well. So I wouldn't let these deter me from buying in that area, because again, as an investor, I need to be focused on the thing that matters, which I'm doing this to create wealth, to give me cash flow. What do I need for cash flow? I need capital wealth. So where do I get the capital wealth from? It is the suburbs that do the heavy lifting of creating that wealth. And the other important thing to remember is that all the other states could eventually follow suit and start following Victoria. So I have noticed some of the other states like WA and Queensland, they were way, way, way more pro-landlord. Even WA and Queensland have started following some of these more pro-tenant rules that Victoria have in place. So still, WA and Queensland have some of the most flexible rules, but they are starting to follow suit. So all of the other states could eventually have the same rules as Victoria. You cannot be in control of that. We are at mercy of too many other rules around us, and as an investor, we just have to learn to navigate them. That's all. So if you want to know any more about these rules, or you want to actually triple check to make sure that these actually still exist, send them, copy and paste this shit and send it to you, or type it out and send it to your property manager. So the things that you can do to get around these things is, number one, taking on a tenant. When you're buying a property, it's already got a tenant in there, making sure that you understand how to evaluate the property yourself and not just trust the property manager, so that you can then bump the rent up to exactly what you have identified is the average for that area. Number two is not signing on existing tenants straight away or renewing them from somebody else that you've taken on, so that you can understand, well, how were they vetted and how did they get in the door? And then the third thing is definitely don't rush into taking on an existing tenant. If you're taking on something if you're buying a property from like an owner-occupier, it's going to be vacant. That is the best outcome when acquiring one. But then just understanding, how were they vetted when they got into the door? Were they let in the door via like private management? That's a few red flags for me. If they were, then I would want to make sure that I put them through the full entire process before I renew them. And also triple check to see if you can just have them month by month whilst you just see what it's like having them. Anyway, I have a lot more information on that with my private one-on-one clients, but if you have any other questions about this, please let me know.